What if I told you that the most terrifying deity in Celtic mythology was not a single being, but three faces of the same cosmic horror, three voices speaking prophecies of doom, three pairs of eyes watching every battlefield where blood has ever been spilled? The Morrigan does not simply exist within the Celtic pantheon. She dominates it, her shadow stretching across every tale of war, every moment of death, every whisper of fate that has ever echoed through the mist-shrouded hills of ancient Ireland. Picture this: a battlefield at dawn, the grass still wet with dew that will soon be replaced by blood. Above the silent ranks of warriors, a single crow circles. But this is no ordinary bird. Its eyes hold intelligence that predates human civilization, and its cry carries messages that only the doomed can truly understand. This is Bodbe, the first face of the Morrigan, and her presence means that before this day ends, souls will be collected. The trinity that comprises the Morrigan represents something far more sophisticated than the simple divine beings found in other mythological traditions. While Greek gods squabble over petty jealousies and Norse deities prepare for a single apocalyptic battle, the Morrigan operates on an entirely different level of cosmic significance. She is simultaneously one and three, a paradox that Celtic philosophers understood intuitively, but modern minds struggle to grasp. Each aspect of her being, Bod, Macha, and Nemain, functions as both an independent entity and an inseparable component of a greater whole, like three instruments playing different melodies that somehow combine into a single, haunting symphony. Bod, whose name derives from the Old Irish word for crow or battle crow, embodies the raw, chaotic fury of combat in its purest form. But to describe her merely as a war spirit would be to miss the profound complexity of her nature. She is prophecy made flesh, the voice that emerges from conflict's aftermath to speak truths that warriors would rather not hear. When she appears as a hooded crow circling above armies preparing for battle, she is not merely observing, she is reading the threads of fate that connect each warrior to their destiny, calculating which souls she will guide to the other world before the sun sets. The transformation between her forms occurs with a fluidity that defies natural law. One moment, she might appear as a gray-cloaked woman standing at the edge of a forest, her features partially obscured by shadow, her eyes holding depths that seem to contain the accumulated sorrow of every death she has ever witnessed. The next moment, that same figure dissolves into a murder of crows that scatter across the sky, each bird carrying a fragment of her consciousness to observe different sections of the battlefield simultaneously. This distributed awareness allows her to perceive conflicts from perspectives impossible for singular beings, tracking individual acts of courage and cowardice, while maintaining comprehensive understanding of the broader tactical situation. Her prophetic abilities extend far beyond simple battlefield outcomes. Bad B perceives the cascading consequences of conflicts, understanding how a single sword stroke might alter the destiny of entire kingdoms generations hence. She sees the children who will never be born because their fathers fell in battle, the alliances that will crumble because key leaders were slain, the technologies that will never be developed because the craftsmen who might have invented them died defending walls that ultimately fell anyway. This comprehensive vision of consequence makes her prophecies simultaneously invaluable and terrifying, for those who hear them must confront not only their own mortality, but the full weight of what their deaths will mean for everyone they leave behind. Macha represents a fundamentally different facet of the Morrigan's power, one more closely tied to sovereignty, territorial dominance, and the establishment of royal authority. Where Badbe embodies the chaos of battle, Macha represents the order that must follow, the establishment of legitimate rule over conquered territories, the sacred bonds between king and land that Celtic society considered essential for prosperity. Her connection to kingship runs deeper than mere political power, touching the fundamental relationship between ruler and territory that formed the cornerstone of Celtic civilization. The testing of potential kings falls within Macha's particular domain, and her methods reveal the sophisticated understanding of leadership that characterized Celtic political philosophy. She does not simply evaluate whether candidates possess sufficient military strength to defend their claims. Any warlord with enough soldiers can hold territory temporarily. Instead, she probes the deeper qualities that distinguish true kings from mere conquerors. Wisdom sufficient to make decisions that benefit the entire realm, rather than just the ruler's personal interests. Justice that can balance competing claims without creating resentments that will fester into future conflicts. And the spiritual sensitivity necessary to maintain the sacred relationship between human authority and divine approval. These tests often begin long before individuals recognize their royal destiny. A young warrior might encounter Macha in the guise of an old woman struggling to carry water from a distant well, testing whether he possesses the compassion to assist those beneath his station, even when no one is watching to reward his virtue. Years later, that same individual might meet a beautiful maiden who offers herself in marriage, evaluating whether he would choose personal desire over duty to his people. Each encounter serves dual purposes, shaping the character of potential rulers while providing Macha with deep insight into their fundamental nature. By the time a candidate actually claims a throne, she has already compiled a comprehensive assessment of their strengths, weaknesses, and the specific type of reign they are likely to provide. Nemain, the third aspect, embodies the psychological terror and confusion that accompanies warfare, the dimension of conflict that modern military theorists would recognize as the fog of war, but elevated to supernatural intensity. Her name connects to the concept of panic or frenzy, and her presence on battlefields creates an atmosphere of dread that can shatter the resolve of even the most seasoned warriors. She does not simply inspire fear, she weaves it into the fabric of combat itself, making terror an integral component of the battlefield experience that cannot be separated from the physical violence occurring around it. The influence of Nemain extends beyond physical confrontations to encompass the mental and spiritual battles that rage within individuals facing momentous decisions. She manifests as the crushing weight of responsibility felt by commanders who must send soldiers to their deaths, the paralyzing uncertainty that grips warriors in the moments before crucial engagements, and the maddening clarity that sometimes descends upon those standing at the threshold between life and death. Her power operates through the mind rather than the body, exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities that even the bravest warriors cannot entirely eliminate. The interconnection between these three aspects creates a dynamic that transcends the sum of its parts. They do not operate as separate entities pursuing independent agendas, but rather as facets of a single consciousness that perceives reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously. This multiplicity allows the Morrigan to engage with the full spectrum of human experience related to conflict, power, and transformation. Where Bad Bee might inspire a warrior's courage through her presence overhead, Macha ensures that courage serves a worthy cause aligned with legitimate authority, while Nemain tests whether that courage can withstand the psychological pressures of leadership and responsibility. Together, they form a complete system for evaluating, shaping, and ultimately judging those who would wield power over others. The etymology of the name Morrigan itself reveals layers of meaning that illuminate her fundamental nature. The most widely accepted derivation traces the name to Mor Riohain, combining Mor meaning great or large with Riohain, the feminine form of king or queen. This construction yields Great Queen, a title that speaks to supreme authority within the divine hierarchy, not merely a goddess among many, but the sovereign of sovereigns, the ultimate arbiter of who deserves to rule and who must fall. However, linguistic analysis reveals additional possibilities that enrich our understanding of her character. An alternative interpretation connects the first element to Mor, meaning phantom or specter, resulting in Phantom Queen. This reading emphasizes her ability to move between the visible and invisible worlds, appearing and disappearing according to her will and purpose, never fully present in any single location, yet potentially manifest anywhere that fate requires her attention. The ambiguity between these interpretations is itself significant, suggesting that the Morrigan exists in a liminal state between different categories of being, simultaneously the most powerful of queens and the most insubstantial of phantoms, ruling over realms that mortal minds can barely comprehend. The linguistic evolution of her name, across different Celtic languages and time periods, demonstrates the widespread recognition of her power throughout the ancient world. In various manuscript traditions, she appears as Morrigan, Morrigu, and Morrigu, with each variation reflecting local pronunciation patterns and scribal conventions while preserving the essential recognition of her divine authority. This consistency across diverse linguistic contexts suggests that her worship and recognition extended throughout the Celtic world, transcending tribal and regional boundaries that normally limited the influence of local deities. The Morrigan was not merely an Irish goddess. She was a pan-Celtic phenomenon, recognized wherever Celtic peoples established their civilizations. Her role as a sovereignty goddess places her at the heart of Celtic concepts of legitimate rule and political authority. Unlike modern notions of political power based on popular mandate or inherited right, Celtic kingship depended on divine approval and the maintenance of proper relationships with the supernatural realm. A king who lost the favor of the gods would find his lands becoming barren, his people suffering from disease and famine, his armies losing battles they should have won. The Morrigan served as the ultimate arbiter of this divine approval, her judgment determining not only whether individuals deserved to rule, but the specific nature of the reign they would experience. The divine judgment she rendered went beyond simple approval or rejection. A king who demonstrated wisdom and justice might receive her blessing for a long and prosperous rule, his lands flourishing with abundant harvests and his people multiplying in peace. One who showed courage but lacked prudence might be granted victory in battle, but warned of future challenges that would test whether his martial virtues could be balanced by the wisdom necessary for governance during peacetime. Her judgments often carried prophetic elements, revealing the likely consequences of particular leadership styles and decision-making patterns, giving rulers the opportunity to modify their behavior before the full weight of divine displeasure descended upon them. This relationship between the Morrigan and royal authority extended to the concept of the sacred marriage between king and land. In Celtic belief, the fertility and prosperity of the territory depended on the ruler's spiritual connection to the divine forces that govern natural cycles. The land itself was understood as a goddess who must be properly honored and ritually wed by each new king, creating a mystical bond that linked the ruler's personal virtue to the welfare of everyone and everything within his domain. The Morrigan, as sovereignty goddess, served as the mediator in this relationship, ensuring that kings maintained proper reverence for the supernatural powers that sustained their realms. A ruler who neglected this spiritual dimension of leadership would find his lands becoming barren, regardless of how skillfully he managed the practical aspects of governance. Crops would fail despite favorable weather, livestock would sicken despite adequate care, and the people would lose their vitality even when no obvious cause for their decline could be identified. These supernatural consequences served as constant reminders that Celtic kingship involved responsibilities that extended far beyond the political and military domains that modern observers might consider the primary concerns of ancient rulers. The symbolic representation of the Morrigan as both creator and destroyer reflects the Celtic understanding of existence as a continuous cycle of birth, growth, decay, and renewal. This duality appears throughout Celtic mythology and represents a fundamental principle of their cosmological worldview. Nothing lasts forever, not kingdoms, not heroes, not even the gods themselves in their current forms. Everything that rises must eventually fall, creating space for new manifestations of life and power to emerge. The Morrigan embodies this principle in her very being, simultaneously nurturing the growth of worthy leaders and kingdoms while orchestrating the downfall of those who have outlived their usefulness or betrayed their sacred responsibilities. Her creative aspect manifests in her role as a shaper of heroes and kingdoms. Through her tests and challenges, she forges individuals capable of leadership, burning away weakness and hesitation to reveal the strength beneath. This process often involves apparent destruction, as candidates must abandon comfortable assumptions and familiar patterns of behavior to embrace the responsibilities of power. The warrior who clings to his previous identity cannot become the king his people need. The prince who refuses to sacrifice his personal desires cannot fulfill the sacred obligations of sovereignty. The Morrigan's creative work operates through transformation rather than gentle nurturing, requiring individuals to die to their former selves and be reborn as something greater. The destructive aspect of her nature serves equally important functions within the cosmic order. She identifies corruption, complacency, and abuse of power, orchestrating the downfall of rulers and systems that have lost their connection to divine purpose. This destruction, while often traumatic for those experiencing it, serves to clear space for new growth and development. A kingdom ruled by a corrupt king cannot be reformed while that king remains in power. The rot must be excised before healing can begin. The Morrigan's destructive power operates with surgical precision, targeting specific elements that threaten the overall health of the social and spiritual order, while preserving those aspects worth maintaining. This cyclical understanding of existence permeated Celtic society and influenced their approach to everything from agricultural practices to political organization. The recognition that all things must eventually pass away, making room for new manifestations of life and power, created a cultural acceptance of change and transformation that distinguished Celtic civilization from many of their contemporaries. Where other cultures might view the fall of a dynasty as a catastrophe to be mourned, Celtic peoples understood such transitions as natural and necessary components of the cosmic cycle. Painful, certainly, but ultimately serving purposes that transcended individual suffering. The Morrigan, as the divine embodiment of this principle, served as both teacher and enforcer of these cosmic laws. Her influence extended beyond individual lives to encompass entire historical epochs. The rise and fall of kingdoms, the emergence of new cultural forms, and the evolution of religious practices all fell within her domain. She perceived patterns and connections that spanned generations, working to maintain the dynamic balance necessary for continued growth and development. This long-term perspective allowed her to make decisions that might seem harsh or incomprehensible to those focused on immediate circumstances, but served essential functions within the broader sweep of history. The earliest surviving Irish texts reveal the Morrigan's emergence as a primordial force within the divine hierarchy, her presence woven into the fundamental fabric of Ireland's mythological landscape from the very beginning of recorded memory. But what came before the beginning? What forces shaped the goddess who would shape so many others? The answers lie buried in manuscripts that have survived fire, flood, and the deliberate destruction of pagan knowledge by those who feared what the old stories might teach. The Lebor Gabala Eren, known in English as the Book of Invasions, chronicles the successive waves of supernatural beings who claimed dominion over Ireland across countless ages. Within these ancient narratives, the Morrigan appears not as a latecomer to divine power, but as an established force whose authority predates the arrival of the Tuatha De Danann themselves. This is a crucial detail that many casual readers overlook. When the gods we think of as the Irish pantheon first set foot on Ireland's shores, the Morrigan was already there, waiting. The manuscript traditions describe her genealogy with the precision typically reserved for royal lineages, establishing her position within the complex web of divine relationships that govern the supernatural hierarchy. As daughter of Ernmas, herself a figure of considerable power within the pantheon, the Morrigan inherited a legacy that connected her to the fundamental forces of sovereignty and territorial dominance. Ernmas appears in the texts as a mother goddess whose offspring would come to embody different aspects of divine authority, with the Morrigan representing the most formidable manifestation of this inherited power. But this maternal connection provided more than mere legitimacy within divine politics. It established the Morrigan's access to primordial knowledge and abilities that had been accumulating through generations of divine beings, wisdom that predated the current cosmic arrangement and touched upon the fundamental principles that governed existence itself. The power she inherited was not simply magical ability or political authority. It was understanding of how reality itself functioned at its deepest levels, knowledge that even other gods could not fully comprehend. Her sisterhood with Bad Ben Masha creates a triad of war goddesses whose combined influence extends across every aspect of conflict and its aftermath. The texts present these relationships not as simple familial bonds, but as interconnected aspects of a singular divine consciousness that manifests through multiple personalities. This is not merely a family of related deities. It is a single entity experiencing existence through three simultaneous perspectives, each contributing unique insights to their collective understanding of war, fate, and power. Bob's mastery of battlefield prophecy complements the Morrigan's broader strategic vision, providing detailed tactical intelligence that can be integrated into comprehensive plans spanning generations. Maka's connection to sovereignty provides the political framework within which their military interventions operate, ensuring that the chaos of war ultimately serves the establishment of legitimate order rather than mere destruction for its own sake. This sisterly triumvirate functions as a divine council of war, with each member contributing specialized knowledge and abilities to their collective decision-making process. The genealogical records preserved in these ancient texts reveal additional connections that illuminate the Morrigan's position within the broader pantheon. Her relationships extend to other significant figures among the Tuatha De Danann, creating a network of divine alliances and rivalries that would influence the supernatural politics of Ireland for generations. These connections often manifested through complex marriage arrangements and temporary partnerships that served specific strategic purposes while maintaining the independence and authority of each divine participant. The mythological cycle presents the Tuatha De Danann's arrival in Ireland as a conquest requiring both military prowess and supernatural manipulation of the landscape itself. They did not simply invade, they transformed the very nature of the island to accommodate their presence, reshaping its spiritual geography to create conditions favorable for their particular type of divine existence. The Morrigan's role in this process extended far beyond simple battlefield support. She actively participated in rewriting the fundamental rules that governed how supernatural and mortal realms would interact within Ireland's borders. The texts describe her involvement in establishing the metaphysical boundaries that would separate the divine realm from the mortal world, creating the liminal spaces where interactions between supernatural and human beings could occur under controlled circumstances. These boundaries were not merely barriers. They were sophisticated systems that regulated the flow of power and information between different levels of existence, preventing the chaos that would result if divine and mortal realms merged completely, while still allowing the communication and cooperation that both sides required. Her mastery of prophecy manifested most dramatically during the primordial conflicts that determined which divine races would ultimately control Ireland's destiny. The war against the Fir Bolg represented the first major test of the Tuatha De Danaan's ability to establish permanent dominion over the island, and the Morrigan's prophetic abilities proved crucial in developing the strategic approaches that would ensure victory. She perceived not only the immediate tactical advantages available to her people, but also the long-term consequences of different approaches to conquest and occupation. Some victories, she understood, would create resentments that would fester for generations, eventually producing rebellions more dangerous than the original conflict. Other approaches, though perhaps more difficult in the short term, would establish foundations for lasting peace and cooperation. Her counsel guided the Tuatha De Danann toward strategies that balanced immediate military necessity against long-term political stability, demonstrating the sophisticated understanding of conflict that distinguished her from deities who saw war merely as an opportunity for glory and plunder. The Second Battle of Mag Tuired, fought against the Fomorians, provided an even more significant demonstration of her prophetic powers and established her reputation as the supreme oracle of the Celtic divine realm. The Fomorians represented primordial chaos and destruction, forces that threatened not only the Tuatha De Danaan's political control, but the fundamental order that allowed civilization to exist. These were not merely rival gods competing for territory. They were embodiments of entropy itself, seeking to unravel the structures that made meaningful existence possible. The Morrigan's visions revealed the catastrophic consequences that would follow a Fomorian victory, showing her people images of Ireland transformed into a wasteland where neither divine nor mortal beings could thrive. The land itself would become corrupted, with rivers running backward, crops withering in fertile soil, and the very air becoming poisonous to breathe. The social order that had allowed civilization to develop would collapse into barbarism, as the Fomorian victory would unleash destructive forces that recognized no boundaries between combatant and innocent, sacred and profane. These prophetic revelations motivated the Tuatha De Danann to commit their full resources to the conflict, understanding that defeat would mean more than political subjugation. It would mean the end of everything they had worked to build and protect. The stakes could not have been higher, and the Morrigan's ability to communicate those stakes clearly and compellingly proved essential for maintaining the unity and determination necessary for victory. Her battlefield magic during these primordial conflicts operated on multiple levels simultaneously, demonstrating the sophisticated integration of different types of supernatural power that characterized her approach to warfare. The texts describe her ability to manipulate the psychological state of opposing forces, creating confusion and terror that weakened their fighting effectiveness before physical combat even began. Warriors who should have been confident in their superior numbers found themselves gripped by inexplicable dread, their hands trembling as they tried to grip weapons that suddenly felt unfamiliar and unwieldy. She could summon supernatural fog that obscured enemy movements, while leaving her allies' vision unimpaired, creating tactical advantages that allowed smaller forces to defeat larger ones through superior coordination and surprise. These magical mists possessed intelligence of their own, moving according to tactical requirements rather than natural wind patterns, providing concealment for advancing troops while exposing enemy positions at crucial moments. The fog carried additional properties that enhanced the effectiveness of Tuatha De Danann magic, while interfering with Fomorian spellcasting, creating environmental advantages that would prove decisive during critical phases of the battle. She could create phantom armies that appeared to multiply the Tuatha De Danann's numbers beyond their actual strength, forcing enemies to divide their forces to address threats that existed only in their perception. These illusions required precise timing and deep understanding of battlefield dynamics, as poorly executed phantoms could backfire and affect her own forces if they could not distinguish real allies from magical constructs. The sophistication of her illusory warfare demonstrated mastery of both magical technique and military psychology, combining supernatural ability with practical understanding of how warriors behave under the stress of combat. The establishment of sacred sites across Ireland represented another crucial aspect of the Morrigan's role in shaping the supernatural landscape that would define Irish spirituality for millennia to come. The texts describe her involvement in identifying locations where the boundaries between different realms remained particularly thin, allowing for easier communication and travel between the divine and mortal worlds. These sites often became focal points for ritual activities and served as anchors for the magical defenses that protected Ireland from supernatural threats originating beyond its borders. Her influence extended to the creation of what the manuscripts term battlefields of the spirit, locations where conflicts between opposing forces of order and chaos would be fought using supernatural rather than physical weapons. These sites required careful preparation and consecration, as the energies released during such confrontations could permanently alter the spiritual characteristics of the surrounding landscape. A poorly chosen location might become a wound in reality itself, a place where the barriers between realms remained permanently weakened and hostile entities could slip through into the mortal world. The Morrigan's expertise in managing these forces made her indispensable to the Tuatha De Danann's efforts to establish a stable supernatural infrastructure capable of supporting their long-term presence in Ireland. She understood not only how to win individual battles, but how to create the conditions that would prevent future conflicts from becoming necessary, or, when conflict proved unavoidable, how to ensure that the aftermath would strengthen rather than weaken the cosmic order she served. The divine interventions attributed to the Morrigan during this period often involved direct manipulation of natural forces to support her people's military objectives. The texts describe instances where she summoned storms to disrupt enemy movements, calling down lightning that struck with impossible precision to eliminate specific targets while leaving nearby allies unharmed. She redirected rivers to flood opposing encampments, turning the landscape itself into a weapon that required no soldiers to wield. In the most dramatic accounts, she caused the earth itself to open and swallow hostile forces, creating chasms that appeared without warning beneath enemy formations and closed again once their victims had been consumed. These interventions required enormous expenditures of divine energy and could only be sustained for limited periods, making their timing crucial to their effectiveness. The Morrigan's strategic genius lay partly in her ability to identify the precise moments when such dramatic interventions would produce maximum impact, conserving her power during phases of battle where conventional forces could achieve adequate results, and unleashing her full supernatural might only when the outcome hung in the balance. Her relationship with the landscape itself evolved throughout these conflicts, as her repeated magical interventions created permanent changes in Ireland's spiritual geography. Locations where she had performed particularly powerful magic retained traces of her presence, becoming sites where future generations could more easily access supernatural assistance or divine guidance. These residual energies also served as early warning systems, alerting the Tuatha De Danann to approaching threats or opportunities that required their attention. The land itself became an extension of her consciousness, a vast sensory network that allowed her to monitor developments across the entire island simultaneously. The genealogical records preserved in the mythological cycle reveal that the Morrigan's divine lineage included connections to primordial forces that predated the organized pantheons of later periods. Her access to these ancient powers provided her with abilities that even other members of the Tuatha De Danann found difficult to understand or replicate. The texts suggest that her prophetic gifts derive partly from this connection to primordial sources of knowledge that existed before the current cosmic order had fully established itself, wisdom from an age when the rules governing reality were still being written. The strategic importance of her role during the foundational conflicts cannot be overstated. The Tuatha De Danann's success in establishing permanent dominion over Ireland depended heavily on their ability to outmaneuver opponents who possessed significant advantages in terms of numbers, territorial familiarity, or supernatural abilities. The Morrigan's prophetic insights provided her people with the strategic intelligence necessary to identify and exploit their enemies' weaknesses while minimizing their own vulnerabilities. Without her guidance, even the considerable powers of the divine race might have proven insufficient against the primordial forces arrayed against them. Her involvement in these primordial battles established patterns of divine intervention that would influence supernatural politics in Ireland for centuries to come. The precedents she set regarding the appropriate use of prophetic knowledge, battlefield magic, and landscape manipulation became part of the divine law that governed future conflicts between supernatural forces. Her decisions during these foundational periods created obligations and restrictions that would bind not only herself, but future generations of divine beings who inherited responsibility for Ireland's supernatural welfare. The mythological cycle presents these early conflicts as formative experiences that shaped the Morrigan's understanding of her role within the cosmic order. The lessons she learned about the relationship between prophecy and action, the limits of magical intervention, and the long-term consequences of battlefield decisions would inform her approach to future challenges. The texts suggest that her involvement in these primordial conflicts transformed her from a powerful but relatively inexperienced divine being into the formidable figure who would later play such crucial roles in the affairs of mortal heroes and kings. The Great Cattle Raid of Cooley stands as one of the most significant episodes in Irish mythology, a conflict that would test the boundaries between divine will and mortal determination in ways that continue to resonate through the centuries. But before we can understand what happened at the ford, we must understand what was at stake. This was not merely a war over livestock, however valuable. This was a cosmic confrontation between fate and free will, between the authority of the gods and the stubborn independence of humanity's greatest champion. Queen Medb of Connacht's decision to launch her massive cattle raid against Ulster created the perfect conditions for the Morrigan's intervention. The supernatural curse that had weakened the men of Ulster left the province virtually defenseless, with only the young warrior Cuchulainn standing between the invading army and total conquest. This imbalance of forces attracted the Morrigan's attention, as such extreme circumstances often preceded significant shifts in the political and spiritual landscape of Ireland. When the cosmic scales tip so dramatically, divine forces take notice. Her prophetic abilities revealed the far-reaching consequences that would flow from this apparently simple cattle raid, consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military objectives of either side. She saw how the conflict would shape the development of Irish heroic tradition for generations, how the deeds performed during this war would become the standards against which future warriors measured themselves, how the choices made by individuals during these desperate days would echo through history in ways none of the participants could imagine. The Morrigan's first approach to Cuchulainn came disguised as a young maiden of extraordinary beauty, her appearance carefully crafted to appeal to the warrior's pride and desires. She presented herself as the daughter of a king, claiming to have traveled great distances, specifically to offer herself in marriage to Ulster's champion. Her beauty transcended mortal standards, with features that seemed to shift subtly in the light, sometimes appearing entirely human, other times revealing hints of her divine nature that a less perceptive observer might dismiss as tricks of shadow and imagination. Her voice carried an otherworldly quality that made her words seem to resonate with deeper meanings, as if each sentence contained layers of significance that only gradually revealed themselves to the listener. Her clothing bore patterns that suggested wealth and status beyond what any mortal king could provide, fabrics that seemed to shimmer with colors that had no names in human languages. Everything about her presentation was designed to overwhelm the senses, while maintaining just enough ambiguity to allow Cuchulainn to believe, if he chose, that she was merely an exceptionally beautiful mortal woman. The maiden spoke of vast herds of cattle and extensive lands that would become Cuchulainn's through their union, describing territories that stretched beyond the horizons of known kingdoms into regions that existed only in the other world. She offered not merely personal alliance, but access to supernatural resources that could ensure Ulster's victory against any conceivable enemy. Her proposal carried implicit promises of divine protection and magical assistance that would make the young warrior invincible in battle, guaranteeing not only his survival, but his eternal glory. The terms she offered seemed almost too generous, suggesting that her interest in him transcended normal political or romantic considerations. A suspicious mind might have wondered what price would eventually be demanded for such extraordinary gifts. But the Morrigan was testing precisely this, whether Cuchulainn possessed the wisdom to recognize that offers which seem too good to be true usually are, and the strength of character to refuse temptation even when acceptance would bring immediate and substantial benefits. Cuchulainn's rejection of this offer demonstrated both his dedication to his current mission and his suspicion regarding the maiden's true identity. His response revealed the tactical thinking that had already made him a formidable opponent despite his youth, as he recognized that accepting such an alliance during active combat would compromise his ability to focus entirely on the immediate threat facing Ulster. He dismissed her offer with characteristic bluntness, stating that he had no time for women's company while defending his homeland against invasion. His words carried an edge of irritation that suggested he viewed her approach as an unwelcome distraction from more pressing concerns. But beneath this surface rudeness lay a deeper strategic calculation. Cuchulainn understood that supernatural offers of assistance often came with hidden costs that might ultimately prove more burdensome than beneficial. His training under the warrior woman Scathach had taught him to be wary of divine interventions that seemed to offer easy solutions to difficult problems. The timing of the maiden's appearance, coinciding with Ulster's moment of greatest vulnerability, raised questions about her true motivations and the price she might eventually demand for her assistance. The Morrigan's response to this rejection revealed both her divine nature and her growing interest in testing the young warrior's resolve. Rather than simply withdrawing her offer, she chose to issue a warning that carried unmistakable prophetic authority. She informed Cuchulainn that his refusal would lead to consequences he had not anticipated, hinting at future encounters that would test his abilities in ways he could not currently imagine. Her words carried the weight of absolute certainty, suggesting that she spoke not from speculation but from direct knowledge of events that had already been determined by fate. The transformation that followed this warning demonstrated the full extent of the Morrigan's shape-shifting abilities. The beautiful maiden dissolved before Cuchulainn's eyes, her form flowing like water as it rearranged itself into something entirely different. The process itself seemed to defy natural laws, as her human features melted away to reveal the sleek black form of a massive crow. The transformation occurred with fluid grace that suggested this was merely one of countless forms she could assume at will, each one perfectly suited to her immediate purposes. As a crow, the Morrigan perched on a nearby branch and delivered her prophecy with the harsh, grating voice characteristic of her corvid form. Her words painted vivid images of the battles to come, describing specific wounds that Cuchulainn would receive, and the circumstances under which he would ultimately meet his death. She spoke of his future encounters with supernatural opponents, each one more dangerous than the last, building toward a final confrontation that would end his remarkable career as Ulster's champion. Her prophecy carried the authority of divine knowledge, presenting these future events as inevitable consequences of his current choices. The content of her prophecy revealed intimate knowledge of Cuchulainn's character and fighting style that could only have come from extensive observation or supernatural insight. She described how his greatest strengths would eventually become weaknesses, how his courage would lead him into situations where even his supernatural abilities would prove insufficient. Her words suggested that his very success in the current conflict would create the conditions for his eventual downfall, as his growing reputation would attract increasingly dangerous opponents seeking to claim his fame for themselves. Cuchulainn's response to this prophecy demonstrated the fierce independence that defined his character throughout his brief but remarkable career. Rather than showing fear or seeking to negotiate with the divine messenger, he challenged her directly, declaring that he would face whatever fate awaited him without seeking supernatural assistance or attempting to avoid his destiny through cowardice. His defiance carried an edge of anger that suggested he viewed the prophecy as an attempt to manipulate him through fear rather than a genuine warning meant for his benefit. This exchange established a pattern that would characterize all subsequent encounters between the Morrigan and Cuchulainn. She would appear in various forms, offering assistance, delivering warnings, or testing his resolve through increasingly elaborate challenges. He would consistently reject her overtures while maintaining his determination to face whatever consequences might follow from his choices. This dynamic created a complex relationship that transcended simple categories of friendship or enmity, becoming instead an ongoing dialogue between divine wisdom and mortal will. The Morrigan's next manifestation came during one of Cuchulainn's most challenging single combats, when exhaustion and accumulated wounds had begun to take their toll on even his supernatural endurance. She appeared as an ancient hag, bent with age and moving with the painful slowness of extreme decrepitude. Her appearance contrasted sharply with the beautiful maiden she had been previously, suggesting that she was testing different approaches to gauge his responses to various forms of supernatural intervention. The hag approached Cuchulainn during a brief respite between combats, when he had withdrawn to tend his wounds and restore his strength for the next challenge. Her timing demonstrated precise knowledge of his physical condition and emotional state, arriving at the moment when he might be most receptive to offers of assistance or most vulnerable to manipulation through sympathy. She presented herself as a refugee from the advancing army, claiming to have lost everything in the conflict and seeking only basic protection from the chaos surrounding them. Her request seemed simple enough: merely asking the warrior to share some of the milk from a cow she claimed to have saved from the raiders. The cow itself appeared to be a perfectly ordinary animal, showing no obvious signs of supernatural origin or magical enhancement. The hag's manner suggested desperate need rather than divine authority, and her words carried the trembling uncertainty of genuine fear. Everything about her presentation encouraged Cuchulainn to view her as exactly what she appeared to be, a helpless victim of the conflict who deserved his protection and assistance. Cuchulainn's response to this encounter revealed different aspects of his character than his previous interaction with the Morrigan had displayed. Despite his exhaustion and the pressing demands of his military situation, he showed genuine compassion for what he believed to be the hag's plight. He accepted the offered milk gratefully, recognizing that his body needed sustenance to continue fighting effectively. His manner toward the old woman demonstrated the courtesy and respect for elders that had been instilled in him during his youth, showing that his earlier rudeness had been specific to circumstances rather than reflecting his general attitude toward others. The milk itself proved to possess restorative properties that went far beyond normal nourishment. As Cuchulainn drank, he felt his strength returning more rapidly than should have been possible, and wounds that had been causing him significant pain began to heal with supernatural speed. The effect was subtle enough that he might have attributed it to natural recovery, combined with proper nourishment, but the extent of his restoration suggested divine intervention. The experience left him feeling more capable of continuing his defense of Ulster, while raising questions about the true nature of his benefactor. The hag's transformation back to her divine form occurred gradually, allowing Cuchulainn to observe the process and understand the full implications of what had transpired. Her bent frame straightened as age fell away from her features, revealing the terrible beauty and awesome presence of the Morrigan in her true form. Her eyes held depths that seemed to contain knowledge of every battle ever fought, and her voice carried authority that made the earth itself seem to listen when she spoke. The revelation of her identity recontextualized everything about their interaction, forcing Cuchulainn to reconsider his assumptions about divine intervention and mortal independence. Her explanation of what had occurred carried both blessing and warning in equal measure. She revealed that the milk had indeed possessed healing properties, but that accepting it had created a bond between them that would influence future encounters. The restoration she had provided came with obligations that Cuchulainn had unknowingly accepted, obligations that would require him to acknowledge her authority in specific circumstances yet to come. Her words suggested that their relationship had moved beyond simple antagonism towards something more complex and potentially more dangerous. The Morrigan's subsequent appearances during the cattle raid took increasingly dramatic forms as she continued testing Cuchulainn's resolve and attempting to influence the conflict's outcome through direct supernatural intervention. Each manifestation pushed the boundaries of what the young warrior could endure, forcing him to develop new capabilities and strategies while revealing the full extent of the goddess's power and her complex motivations for involving herself so deeply in mortal affairs. She manifested as a red heifer that charged through the battlefield, creating chaos among both armies and forcing warriors to abandon their organized formations in favor of individual survival. The heifer's massive bulk and supernatural strength allowed her to scatter formations that had taken hours to assemble, while her intelligence enabled her to target specific individuals whose removal would create maximum tactical disruption. Her movements seemed random at first glance, but careful observation revealed a pattern designed to separate Cuchulainn from potential allies while driving enemy forces toward positions where they would be most vulnerable to his attacks. The red coloration of her bovine form carried symbolic significance that connected her transformation to themes of sacrifice and divine authority. In Celtic tradition, red animals often served as messengers from the other world or manifestations of supernatural power, and the Morrigan's choice of this particular hue emphasized the sacred nature of her challenge to Cuchulainn. The heifer's hide seemed to glow with internal light that became more pronounced during moments of intense activity, creating an aura of otherworldly presence that distinguished her clearly from any natural animal. Her bovine charges combined raw physical power with tactical sophistication that reflected her divine intelligence, operating through animal instincts enhanced far beyond their natural limits. The heifer could change direction with impossible agility for a creature of her apparent size, using momentum and weight as weapons while maintaining the mobility necessary to avoid retaliation. Her hooves struck the ground with force that created small tremors, and her horns carried the sharpness of forged weapons, despite appearing entirely natural in their construction. Cuchulainn's response to this challenge demonstrated his ability to analyze and counter supernatural threats through careful observation and tactical adaptation. Rather than meeting the heifer's charges head-on, he used his superior agility to force her into positions where her size became a disadvantage rather than an asset. His strategy involved leading her into terrain features that would limit her mobility while providing him with opportunities to strike at vulnerable points without exposing himself to devastating counterattacks. The transformation into an eel represented perhaps the most insidious of the Morrigan's challenges, as it moved the conflict into an environment where Cuchulainn's usual advantages were severely compromised. The aquatic setting eliminated his ability to use solid footing for leverage, while the eel's serpentine form allowed her to attack from angles that would be impossible for land-based opponents. Her coils possessed crushing strength that could break bones or restrict breathing, while her slippery skin made maintaining any grip extremely difficult. The eel's movements through the water displayed supernatural grace that seemed to defy the normal physics of aquatic locomotion. She could change direction instantaneously without the transitional movements that characterized ordinary fish, appearing to teleport from one position to another with fluid continuity that disoriented opponents attempting to track her location. Her length seemed to vary according to tactical requirements, sometimes appearing as a relatively modest serpent, other times extending to proportions that allowed her to encircle her target multiple times. Her underwater attacks targeted specific pressure points and joints that would maximize damage while minimizing the energy required for each strike. The eel's knowledge of anatomy extended beyond normal animal instincts to encompass detailed understanding of human physiology and the specific vulnerabilities created by combat gear and fighting stances. Her coils would tighten around armor joints, where the metal plates offered less protection, or apply pressure to nerve centers that could cause temporary paralysis in specific limbs. Cuchulainn's eventual victory over the eel required him to develop entirely new fighting techniques adapted to the aquatic environment. His underwater combat style emphasized efficient movements that conserved oxygen while maximizing the effectiveness of each action. He learned to use the water's resistance as an aid rather than an obstacle, allowing the current to add power to his strikes while using buoyancy to enhance his mobility in three-dimensional space. The struggle tested not only his physical capabilities, but his mental adaptability, requiring him to develop new strategies while under extreme pressure. The wolf transformation presented different challenges that tested Cuchulainn's ability to maintain situational awareness while engaged in complex multi-opponent combat scenarios. The Morrigan's lupine form combined the pack-hunting instincts of natural wolves with supernatural intelligence and coordination abilities that allowed her to function as both independent threat and tactical coordinator for other opponents. Her gray coat seemed to shift and blur at the edges, making it difficult to track her exact position during rapid movement sequences. The wolf's attack patterns revealed sophisticated understanding of human combat psychology, and the specific vulnerabilities created by different fighting stances and weapon choices. She would circle her opponents to identify blind spots and timing weaknesses, then coordinate her strikes to exploit these openings while her target was committed to other actions. Her movements possessed predatory patience that allowed her to wait for optimal opportunities rather than rushing into premature attacks that might alert her prey to her presence. Her supernatural strength manifested through bite force that could crush metal armor and claw strikes that left gouges in stone surfaces. The wolf's speed exceeded that of any natural predator, allowing her to close distances that should have provided adequate reaction time for experienced warriors. Her endurance seemed limitless, as she could maintain peak performance throughout extended combat sequences without showing signs of fatigue that would normally affect even supernatural entities. The coordination between the wolf form and human opponents demonstrated the Morrigan's ability to maintain tactical awareness across multiple manifestations simultaneously. She could process information from her lupine senses while simultaneously analyzing the broader battlefield situation and adjusting her strategy accordingly. This multi-perspective awareness allowed her to anticipate opponent movements and coordinate complex tactical maneuvers that would have been impossible for entities limited to single viewpoints. Cuchulain's response to this multi-front assault demonstrated the combat instincts that had made him Ulster's premier warrior despite his youth. Rather than allowing himself to be overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation, he simplified the tactical problem by using his superior mobility to control the positioning of both opponents. His movements became a deadly dance that kept both enemies in sight while preventing them from coordinating their attacks effectively. The battle showcased his ability to think strategically even under extreme pressure, turning apparent disadvantages into opportunities for victory. The resolution of this encounter came when Cuchulain managed to use the wolf's own attack against his human opponent, timing his evasive maneuver so that the Morrigan's charge carried her directly into the other warrior's path. The collision disrupted both opponents' attacks and created an opening that he exploited with devastating effectiveness. His victory demonstrated not only his fighting skills, but his ability to turn the Morrigan's own tactics against her, using her supernatural abilities as weapons in his own arsenal. Throughout these encounters, the relationship between divine prophecy and mortal choice remained a central theme that added philosophical depth to the physical conflicts. The Morrigan's predictions about Cuchulain's ultimate fate carried the weight of divine authority, yet his continued success in overcoming her challenges suggested that destiny might be more flexible than her words implied. Each victory he achieved against her various manifestations seemed to push his prophesied doom further into the future, raising questions about whether fate was truly immutable or could be altered through sufficient determination and skill. The complex emotions that characterized the Morrigan's involvement in these events revealed aspects of her divine nature that transcended simple categories of good and evil. Her warnings to Cuchulain carried genuine concern for his welfare, even as her challenges tested him in ways that could easily have resulted in his death. She seemed torn between her role as a harbinger of fate and her growing admiration for the young warrior's courage and determination. This internal conflict added tragic dimensions to their interactions, as she found herself bound by cosmic law to herald the doom of a hero she had come to respect and perhaps even favor. Her position as both antagonist and potential ally created a dynamic tension that elevated their encounters beyond simple combat scenarios. Each meeting between them carried multiple layers of meaning, functioning simultaneously as tests of strength, exchanges of prophecy, and negotiations over the terms of their ongoing relationship. The Morrigan's divine nature allowed her to perceive possibilities and consequences that remained hidden from mortal awareness. Yet Cuchulainn's extraordinary determination repeatedly forced her to recalculate her predictions and adjust her approach to their interactions. The broader implications of their relationship extended far beyond the immediate context of the cattle raid to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of heroism and the price of greatness. Cuchulainn's consistent rejection of divine assistance, even when it might have ensured his survival, reflected a moral framework that valued independence and self-reliance above personal safety. His willingness to face prophesied doom rather than compromise his principles established him as a tragic figure whose greatest strengths would ultimately contribute to his destruction. The Morrigan's role in these events demonstrated the complex responsibilities that came with divine knowledge and power. Her ability to foresee future events created obligations to warn those who might be affected, yet her warnings often became self-fulfilling prophecies that helped bring about the very outcomes she had predicted. This paradox reflected deeper truths about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility, suggesting that awareness of future events carried moral burdens that could not be easily resolved through simple action or inaction. The Morrigan's mastery of transformation transcended mere magical ability, representing instead a fundamental aspect of her divine nature that allowed her to manifest different facets of supernatural power according to the demands of each situation. Her shape-shifting capabilities operated on multiple levels simultaneously, encompassing not only physical metamorphosis, but also the ability to embody distinct archetypal forces that resonated with the deepest fears and aspirations of mortal consciousness. Each form she assumed carried its own symbolic weight and practical applications, creating a repertoire of manifestations that made her one of the most versatile and unpredictable figures in the Celtic pantheon. The battle-crow form known as Badbe served as her most iconic and frequently employed transformation, one that connected her directly to the liminal space between life and death that defined every battlefield. When the Morrigan assumed this shape, she became more than a simple corvid. Her presence transformed the very nature of the conflict itself, as her harsh cries carried messages that transcended ordinary communication. The battlecrow possessed intelligence that far exceeded any natural bird, with eyes that seemed to hold knowledge of every warrior's fate, and a voice that could inspire courage in the worthy, while striking terror into the hearts of those destined for defeat. Her corvid form measured larger than any ordinary crow, with wings that created shadows disproportionate to her apparent size, and feathers that seemed to absorb light rather than merely reflecting it. The battle crow's movements possessed an otherworldly grace that suggested conscious control over wind currents and air pressure, allowing her to hover motionlessly above specific warriors or dive with supernatural speed toward particular targets. Her talons gleamed with metallic sharpness that could rend armor as easily as flesh, while her beak carried the authority to deliver divine pronouncements that would echo in the minds of those who heard them long after the battle had ended. The significance of this transformation extended far beyond its practical battlefield applications to encompass her role as Psychopomp, the divine guide responsible for shepherding souls between the mortal realm and the otherworld. The battle crow served as the visible manifestation of this cosmic responsibility, appearing at the moment of death to ensure that departing spirits found their proper destinations in the afterlife. Her presence during a warrior's final moments carried both comfort and authority, as she represented the divine guarantee that death in honorable combat would be rewarded with appropriate recognition in the otherworld. The process of soul guidance required intimate knowledge of each warrior's character and deeds, as the otherworld contained multiple destinations that corresponded to different levels of heroic achievement and moral worth. The Morrigan's corvid form allowed her to observe battles from perspectives impossible for ground-based entities, tracking individual acts of courage and cowardice while maintaining awareness of the broader tactical situation. This comprehensive observation enabled her to make precise judgments about each soul's proper destination, ensuring that the cosmic order maintained its balance even amid the chaos of warfare. Her cries from the battlefield served multiple communicative functions that operated simultaneously on different levels of consciousness. To ordinary warriors, her voice might sound like the harsh calling of carrion birds, but those with supernatural awareness could discern specific messages about tactical developments, divine favor, or prophetic warnings about future events. The battle crow's vocalizations carried across vast distances without losing their clarity, allowing her to coordinate supernatural interventions or relay information between widely separated groups of allies. The psychological impact of her corvid presence on battlefield participants could not be underestimated, as the appearance of the battle crow often marked turning points in conflicts that had previously seemed evenly matched. Warriors who spotted her circling overhead might interpret her presence as either favorable or ominous, depending on their own spiritual condition and the nature of their cause. Those fighting for just purposes often reported feeling renewed strength and clarity when the battle crow appeared, while those engaged in dishonorable conflicts frequently experienced sudden doubt and confusion that undermined their fighting effectiveness. At rivers and streams throughout Ireland, the Morrigan's appearances as an ancient hag washing the armor and weapons of doomed warriors created some of the most haunting and prophetically significant encounters in Celtic mythology. This manifestation, known as the Bean Seed, or Washing Woman, served as both herald and arbiter of fate for those whose time in the mortal realm was drawing to a close. Her presence at these liminal waterways marked the intersection between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, creating sacred spaces where divine judgment could be rendered and prophetic truths revealed. The hag's appearance varied according to the specific circumstances of each encounter, but certain elements remained consistent across all manifestations. Her age seemed to encompass centuries of accumulated wisdom and sorrow, with features that suggested intimate familiarity with countless deaths and the grief that followed them. Her clothing appeared to be woven from mist and shadow, garments that seemed substantial enough to provide covering yet insubstantial enough to suggest otherworldly origin. Her hands, though gnarled with apparent age, moved with surprising dexterity as she performed the ritual washing that would cleanse the equipment of fallen heroes. The washing process itself carried deep symbolic significance that connected individual deaths to broader cosmic cycles of renewal and transformation. Each piece of armor or weaponry that passed through her hands represented not merely military equipment, but the accumulated deeds and character of its owner. The water she used seemed to possess purifying properties that could remove the stains of unworthy actions while preserving the luster of honorable achievements. Her washing technique followed patterns that suggested ritual significance, with specific movements and rhythms that corresponded to different aspects of the purification process. Warriors who encountered the Washing Woman faced a choice that would determine not only their immediate fate, but their ultimate destination in the afterlife. Those who approached her with respect and humility might receive warnings about future dangers or advice about how to face their approaching doom with honor intact. However, those who showed arrogance or attempted to avoid their destiny through cowardice would find their fate sealed beyond any possibility of reprieve. The prophetic visions that accompanied these encounters often revealed events extending far beyond the immediate death being foretold. Her manifestation as a beautiful maiden represented perhaps the most complex and morally challenging of her transformations, as it tested not only the physical courage that warriors had trained to display, but also their wisdom, virtue, and ability to recognize divine authority, even when it appeared in unexpected forms. These encounters often occurred at moments when heroes had achieved significant victories or reached important crossroads in their careers, times when their confidence might make them vulnerable to pride or poor judgment. The maiden's beauty transcended normal human attractiveness to encompass supernatural allure that could overwhelm the senses and cloud rational thought. Her features seemed to embody the ideal of feminine perfection, as understood by each individual observer, appearing slightly different to different viewers while maintaining consistent core characteristics that marked her as extraordinary. Her voice carried musical qualities that made her words seem more persuasive and meaningful than ordinary speech, while her movements possessed grace that suggested divine rather than mortal origin. The offers she made to heroes during these encounters typically involved marriage alliances that would provide access to supernatural resources, territorial expansion, or divine protection. However, these proposals always carried hidden costs or obligations that were not immediately apparent to the recipients. The maiden's terms might seem generous on the surface, while actually requiring sacrifices of independence, moral compromise, or abandonment of existing responsibilities that would ultimately prove more valuable than the benefits offered. The testing aspect of these encounters operated on multiple levels, simultaneously evaluating not only the hero's immediate response, but also his underlying character traits and value system. Heroes who rejected the maiden's offers for honorable reasons might find themselves rewarded with genuine divine assistance in future endeavors, while those who accepted for selfish motives would discover that their bargains carried unexpected consequences. The Morrigan's ability to perceive the true motivations behind each response allowed her to render accurate judgments about each hero's worthiness for different types of divine favor. Her shape-shifting abilities extended beyond these primary forms to encompass a virtually unlimited range of manifestations that could be adapted to specific situations and requirements. She could appear as any type of animal, human, or supernatural entity, with each transformation carrying its own symbolic associations and practical capabilities. The consistency of her core personality across all these forms demonstrated that her shape-shifting represented conscious choice rather than involuntary change, with each manifestation serving specific purposes within her broader supernatural agenda. The sacred marriage between the Morrigan and the Dagda stands as one of the most profound and cosmically significant events in Celtic mythology, representing far more than a simple romantic union between two powerful deities. This divine coupling embodied the fundamental forces that governed existence itself, the eternal dance between creation and destruction, fertility and warfare, order and chaos that maintained the delicate balance necessary for life to flourish. The timing of their union, occurring annually at Samhain, when the veil between worlds grew thinnest, emphasized its role as a cosmic ritual that renewed the spiritual foundations upon which Ireland's prosperity depended. The Dagda himself represented the archetypal father figure of the Tuatha De Danann, a deity whose domains encompassed fertility, agriculture, strength, and the protective aspects of divine authority. His massive physical form reflected his role as a provider and protector, with strength sufficient to wield weapons that lesser beings could barely lift and wisdom accumulated through countless generations of divine existence. The Dagda's connection to the earth's fertility made him an ideal counterpart to the Morrigan's dominion over the cycles of death and renewal, as their combined influence could ensure that the land remained productive while maintaining the spiritual defenses necessary to protect it from supernatural threats. Their annual meeting occurred along the banks of the river Unius, known in some sources as the River Unshin, a waterway whose significance extended far beyond its geographical importance to encompass its role as a liminal boundary between different realms of existence. The river's waters possessed qualities that distinguished them from ordinary streams, flowing with currents that seemed to respond to supernatural influences and carrying sediments that enriched the surrounding countryside with unusual fertility. The location itself had been chosen through divine consultation, as both deities recognized that their union required a setting that could contain and channel the enormous energies their coupling would generate. The riverbank where they met each Saman bore the accumulated traces of their previous encounters, creating a sacred grove where the normal laws of nature operated according to different principles. Trees in this location grew larger and lived longer than their counterparts elsewhere, their roots extending deep into soil that had been blessed by repeated divine presence. The grass remained green throughout winter months when other vegetation had died back, and flowers bloomed out of season, as if responding to the residual warmth of divine passion that lingered in the earth itself. The Morrigan's approach to these annual meetings reflected her complex nature as both war goddess and fertility deity, arriving in forms that emphasized different aspects of her divine authority depending on the specific needs of the coming year. Sometimes she appeared as the battle crow, her dark wings casting shadows that spoke of conflicts to come, and victories that would be won through proper preparation and divine favor. Other times she manifested as the beautiful maiden, her appearance radiating the promise of abundance and growth that would follow their union. Her choice of forms served as both greeting and prophecy, communicating to the Dagda the particular challenges and opportunities that lay ahead for their people. The Dagda's preparation for these encounters involved rituals that demonstrated his understanding of the cosmic significance of their union. He would arrive bearing gifts that represented the earth's bounty, fruits that had ripened beyond their normal season, grains that carried the promise of future harvests, and mead brewed from honey gathered by bees that had been blessed by divine favor. These offerings served not as payment for the Morrigan's favor, but as symbols of the abundance that their union would create, tangible representations of the fertility that would flow from their divine coupling. Their physical union occurred in a grove specifically consecrated for this purpose, where ancient oaks formed a natural cathedral whose branches created a canopy that filtered moonlight into patterns of sacred geometry. The ground beneath these trees had been worn smooth by countless years of divine presence, creating a natural amphitheater where the earth itself seemed to rise up to embrace the divine lovers. The air in this space carried qualities that distinguished it from the surrounding atmosphere, with currents that moved according to supernatural rather than meteorological patterns. The coupling itself generated energies that rippled outward from their meeting place, in waves that could be felt throughout Ireland and beyond. These pulses of divine power carried different qualities depending on the specific nature of their union in any given year, sometimes emphasizing fertility and growth, other times focusing on protection and martial strength, but always maintaining the fundamental balance between opposing forces that kept the cosmic order stable. The intensity of these emanations varied according to the challenges that lay ahead for the Tuatha De Danann and the mortal inhabitants of Ireland, with more difficult periods requiring more powerful infusions of divine energy. The exchange of knowledge that occurred during their union transcended ordinary communication to encompass a direct sharing of consciousness that allowed each deity to access the other's accumulated wisdom and prophetic insights. The Morrigan's visions of future conflicts merged with the Dagda's understanding of agricultural cycles and seasonal patterns, creating a comprehensive awareness of the challenges and opportunities that would characterize the coming year. This shared knowledge enabled them to coordinate their individual interventions in mortal affairs, ensuring that their separate actions would complement rather than conflict with each other. The prophetic visions they shared during these encounters often revealed events extending far into the future, showing not only immediate challenges but also the long-term consequences of different possible responses to those challenges. The Morrigan's battlefield insights combined with the Dagda's agricultural wisdom to create detailed predictions about how military conflicts would affect food production, how changes in weather patterns might influence political stability, and how supernatural threats might impact the spiritual health of the land itself. Their discussions during these annual meetings addressed strategic concerns that affected the entire Tuatha De Danann pantheon, as the Union served as an opportunity for high-level divine consultation about matters too complex or sensitive for more public forums. The Morrigan's intelligence network, maintained through her various manifestations and supernatural agents, provided detailed information about developing threats and emerging opportunities. The Dagda's connections to the agricultural communities throughout Ireland gave him insight into the concerns and needs of the mortal population that depended on divine protection and favor. The magical knowledge they exchanged encompassed both practical techniques and theoretical understanding that enhanced their individual capabilities while strengthening their collective ability to protect and guide their people. The Morrigan shared her insights into battlefield magic and psychological warfare, teaching the Dagda methods for inspiring courage in allied forces while sowing confusion among enemies. In return, the Dagda provided instruction in fertility magic and agricultural enhancement, showing her how to ensure that lands ravaged by warfare could recover their productivity more quickly than would normally be possible. Their union also served to renew and strengthen the magical defenses that protected Ireland from supernatural threats originating beyond its borders. The combined energies of their coupling reinforced the spiritual barriers that prevented hostile entities from other realms from establishing footholds in the mortal world, while simultaneously enhancing the natural magical properties of the landscape itself. These defenses operated on multiple levels, creating physical obstacles for invading forces, while also establishing psychological and spiritual impediments that would discourage supernatural enemies from attempting conquest. The fertility aspect of their union manifested not only in agricultural abundance, but also in the spiritual vitality of the Irish people, as their divine coupling renewed the connection between mortal and divine realms that enabled humans to access supernatural assistance when faced with extraordinary challenges. This spiritual fertility ensured that each generation would produce individuals capable of serving as bridges between worlds, heroes and druids who could communicate with divine beings and channel supernatural power for the benefit of their communities. The timing of their annual meeting at Samhain emphasized the transitional nature of their union, as this festival marked the point when the old year died and the new year began its cycle of growth and development. Their coupling served as the catalyst that initiated this cosmic renewal, providing the divine energy necessary to sustain life through the dark months of winter and ensure that spring would bring the promised return of warmth and growth. The symbolic death and rebirth represented by the seasonal cycle found its divine expression in the union between destruction and creation, embodied by the Morrigan and Dagda. Modern attempts to reconstruct Morrigan divination face significant challenges due to the fragmentary nature of surviving evidence and the difficulty of recovering the experiential dimensions of ancient practice. Contemporary practitioners draw upon medieval Irish texts, comparative studies of other divinatory traditions, and personal experiential exploration to develop working systems that honor historical precedents, while acknowledging the impossibility of perfect reconstruction. These modern approaches represent creative engagements with ancient traditions rather than direct continuations of unbroken practice. The psychological dimensions of Morrigan divination offer fascinating territory for contemporary analysis, regardless of one's beliefs about the literal reality of divine communication. The practice required and developed heightened observational skills, pattern recognition abilities, and intuitive capacities that have value independent of their original religious context. The framework of goddess communication provided a structure through which practitioners could access and articulate insights that might otherwise remain unconscious or inarticulate. The aesthetic dimensions of Morrigan divination, the dramatic imagery of crows against stormy skies, the haunting sounds of battlefield prophecy, the mysterious depths of water gazing, continue to inspire artistic and literary creation. These evocative elements transcend their original religious functions to speak to enduring human fascinations with fate, death, and the possibility of glimpsing what lies beyond ordinary perception. The goddess who once communicated through these channels remains a powerful symbolic presence, even for those who encounter her only through creative works. The Morrigan's pervasive presence in Celtic religious consciousness profoundly shaped a warrior culture that defined much of ancient Irish and broader Celtic society, creating a complex interrelationship between divine mythology and human martial practice that influenced everything from individual combat techniques to large-scale military strategy. Understanding this influence requires examining how belief in the war goddess affected psychological preparation for battle, the ritualistic dimensions of warfare, concepts of martial honor, and the social structures that supported military activity. The psychological impact of believing oneself observed and potentially favored by a powerful war deity cannot be overstated when considering the mindset of Celtic warriors entering combat. The knowledge that the Morrigan watched every battlefield, that she actively chose which warriors would receive glory and which would fall, created a framework of meaning that transformed the chaos of combat into a spiritually significant arena. Warriors did not merely fight for territorial gain or political objectives. They performed before divine eyes, with their actions carrying weight in cosmic as well as earthly terms. This divine observation created powerful motivational effects that military leaders understood and deliberately cultivated. Pre-battle rituals invoking the Morrigan's favor served not only religious purposes, but also practical psychological functions, building courage and commitment among warriors who believed themselves supported by supernatural power. The famous battle frenzy attributed to Irish warriors, the rheostrad or warp spasm that transformed fighters into seemingly superhuman combatants, was understood as a form of divine possession in which the Morrigan's power flowed through mortal vessels. The concept of the Morrigan choosing the slain introduced fatalistic elements into Celtic warrior psychology that paradoxically enhanced rather than diminished combat effectiveness. If death in battle was ultimately determined by divine will rather than individual skill or luck, then excessive fear of death became somewhat irrational. One would die when the goddess decreed, regardless of personal caution. This fatalism freed warriors to fight with abandon, taking risks that more death-fearing combatants might avoid, potentially creating the fierce fighting style that Roman observers noted with a mixture of admiration and horror. Yet the Morrigan's mythology also emphasized that divine favor was not guaranteed and could be lost through improper behavior or failure to observe appropriate rituals. This uncertainty maintained tension within the fatalistic framework, preventing warriors from becoming recklessly overconfident. The goddess who granted victory could equally decree defeat. Her favor required continuous cultivation through proper conduct, ritual observance, and demonstration of the martial virtues she valued. This dynamic balance between confidence and humility shaped the psychological profile of the ideal Celtic warrior. The ritualistic dimensions of Celtic warfare reflected the Morrigan's influence at every stage of military activity. From the initial decision to engage in conflict through post-battle observances honoring the dead and thanking the gods for victory. Before campaigns began, elaborate divination rituals sought to determine whether the goddess favored the planned military action. Negative omens could delay or cancel operations entirely, demonstrating the practical power that religious considerations held over military decision-making. Pre-battle rituals, specifically invoking the Morrigan, typically involved offerings, prayers, and sometimes animal sacrifice, intended to secure her active support in the coming conflict. Warriors might make personal vows to the goddess, promising specific actions or offerings in exchange for her protection and favor. These individual commitments supplemented collective rituals performed by religious specialists, creating multiple layers of divine engagement that surrounded military activity with sacred significance. The conduct of battle itself incorporated ritualistic elements that reflected Morrigan worship. The famous Celtic practice of taking enemy heads as trophies connected to beliefs about the head as the seat of the soul and the spiritual power that could be captured through this practice. The Morrigan, as a goddess associated with death and the transition between life and afterlife, presided over these trophy-taking practices that transformed killed enemies into sources of spiritual power for their victors. Battle cries and war chants invoking the Morrigan served both religious and practical functions, simultaneously honoring the goddess and intimidating enemies who shared knowledge of her terrible power. The psychological warfare dimensions of Celtic combat, the use of noise, dramatic appearance, and terrifying behavior to unnerve opponents, aligned with the Morrigan's own mythological practices of using fear as a weapon. Warriors who successfully channeled the goddess's terrifying aspect gained advantages that transcended purely physical combat capabilities. Post-battle rituals acknowledged the Morrigan's role in determining the conflict's outcome and sought to maintain her favor for future engagements. Thanksgiving offerings recognized her contribution to victory, while mourning practices for fallen warriors incorporated beliefs about her role in guiding the dead to their appropriate afterlife destinations. The battlefield itself became a sacred space through the blood shed upon it, requiring appropriate ritual treatment before normal activities could resume. The concept of martial honor in Celtic warrior culture bore the Morrigan's influence in its emphasis on courage, ferocity, and willingness to face death without flinching. The goddess valued warriors who embodied these qualities, and her mythological interactions with heroes like Cuchulainn established templates for honorable martial conduct. Cowardice, the ultimate warrior failing, represented not merely social disgrace, but spiritual offense against a deity who demanded courage from those who sought her favor. The complex relationship between individual glory and collective military success reflected tensions within Morrigan mythology itself. The goddess celebrated individual heroic achievement, the single combat victories, the dramatic stands against overwhelming odds, the personal feats that distinguished exceptional warriors from ordinary fighters. Yet she also presided over the mass slaughter of battles, the collective violence that determined the fates of entire peoples. Celtic warrior culture navigated these tensions through systems that rewarded individual distinction while maintaining the group cohesion necessary for effective military operations. Training practices for Celtic warriors incorporated religious dimensions that connected martial skill development to divine favor. Young warriors learn not only fighting techniques but also the ritual practices, mythological knowledge, and psychological attitudes that proper Morrigan worship required. The integration of religious and martial education ensured that warriors understood their activities within sacred frameworks, preventing the development of purely secular military professionalism that might have undermined the motivational power of religious belief. The social structures supporting Celtic military activity reflected the Morrigan's influence in their integration of religious and martial functions. Warrior bands often maintained their own ritual specialists who focused specifically on war-related religious practices, ensuring that military units had continuous access to divine guidance and favor. The overlap between warrior and priestly roles in some Celtic contexts, druids who also fought, warriors who also performed religious functions, demonstrated the inseparability of martial and sacred activities in this cultural system. Women's roles in Celtic warrior culture connected to the Morrigan's female identity in complex ways that distinguished Celtic practices from those of many neighboring cultures. The goddess's power demonstrated that martial prowess was not exclusively masculine, providing mythological precedent for the female warriors who appear in Irish legendary literature and who may have had historical counterparts. The Morrigan's sexuality, her use of erotic power alongside martial force, suggested models of feminine strength that integrated rather than opposed different aspects of female identity. The influence of Morrigan worship on Celtic military strategy extended beyond individual psychology and ritual practice to shape larger patterns of warfare. The emphasis on decisive battle, on seeking confrontations that would allow the goddess to render clear judgments about which side deserved victory, may have influenced Celtic preferences for pitched battle over prolonged campaigns of maneuver and attrition. The religious significance attached to battlefield outcomes made inconclusive results spiritually unsatisfying, potentially driving tactical choices that prioritize dramatic confrontation. The decline of traditional Celtic warrior culture under Roman conquest and later Christian conversion gradually transformed the Morrigan's military influence, yet traces persisted in modified forms. Medieval Irish literature preserved memories of the goddess's martial associations, even as Christian authors reinterpreted her nature and significance. The warrior values she had embodied, courage, ferocity, acceptance of fate, continued to shape Irish martial traditions long after explicit goddess worship had ceased. Contemporary military organizations, while obviously not worshipping the Morrigan, sometimes invoke her imagery or name in ways that acknowledge the enduring power of her mythological associations. Military units, weapon systems, and operations have occasionally received names connecting them to the Celtic war goddess, demonstrating how ancient symbolic resources continue to serve modern purposes of motivation and identity formation. These contemporary invocations, however superficial, testify to the lasting impact of Morrigan mythology on human understanding of warfare and those who wage it. The scholarly study of Celtic warrior culture increasingly recognizes the impossibility of understanding martial practices apart from their religious contexts, with the Morrigan serving as a crucial key to unlocking the spiritual dimensions of ancient Celtic warfare. Archaeological evidence of weapon deposits, battlefield rituals, and warrior burials gains fuller meaning when interpreted through the lens of Morrigan worship, revealing the sacred significance that permeated activities modern observers might view as purely secular violence. The Morrigan's presence in Celtic religious consciousness extended beyond abstract theological concepts to manifest in specific geographical locations that served as focal points for her worship, sites of her mythological activities, and landscapes imbued with her spiritual power. This sacred geography created a network of places across Ireland and potentially broader Celtic territories, where the goddess's influence was believed to concentrate, shaping patterns of pilgrimage, ritual practice, and territorial identity that persisted for centuries. The most significant site associated with the Morrigan was Uaim Ag Cat, the Cave of the Cats, located at Rathcrogan in County Roscommon. This limestone cave, descending into darkness beneath the earth, was believed to serve as an entrance to the other world, and specifically as the Morrigan's dwelling place during the winter months. The cave's physical characteristics, its narrow entrance, its descent into absolute darkness, its connection to underground water systems, perfectly suited mythological associations with death, transformation, and the hidden realms beneath ordinary reality. Rathcrogan itself, the ancient royal site of Connacht, provided a broader sacred landscape within which the Cave of the Cats held particular significance. The complex of earthworks, burial mounds, and ritual enclosures at Rathcrogan created a ceremonial center where political and religious power intersected, with the Morrigan's nearby dwelling adding supernatural weight to the site's importance. Kings inaugurated at Rathcrogan ruled under the shadow of the war goddess's presence, their authority implicitly connected to her approval and support. The annual emergence of the Morrigan from her cave at Salmon, the festival marking the beginning of the dark half of the year, transformed this site into a focal point for seasonal observances that acknowledged the goddess's cyclical movements between worlds. Pilgrims and worshippers gathering at Rathcrogan during Salmon participated in rituals that recognized the thinning of boundaries between mortal and divine realms, with the Cave of the Cats serving as a literal doorway through which supernatural beings might pass. Beyond Rathcrogan, numerous other locations across Ireland claimed associations with the Morrigan through mythological narratives, place name evidence, or local traditions. Rivers and fords where the goddess was said to have appeared, hills where she was believed to survey battlefields, and plains where her mythological activities unfolded, all became marked as sacred spaces bearing her influence. This distribution of Morrigan-associated sites created a sacred geography that extended across much of the island, ensuring that her presence could be felt in diverse regional contexts. The River Unius, where the Morrigan's famous encounter with the Dagda occurred, exemplified how specific waterways could become charged with mythological significance. The goddess's annual appearance at this river, her sexual union with the chief of the gods, and her subsequent prophecies transformed an ordinary watercourse into a site of cosmic importance. Similar processes of mythological inscription marked other rivers, lakes, and springs throughout Celtic territories, creating aquatic sacred geography that complemented terrestrial sites. Battlefield locations where the Morrigan was believed to have appeared or intervened acquired lasting sacred status that persisted long after the conflicts themselves had faded from living memory. The plains of Mag Tuired, site of the great battles between the Tuatha De Danann and their enemies, remained spiritually potent spaces where the goddess's ancient activities continued to resonate. Warriors and pilgrims visiting such sites could connect with the mythological past, drawing inspiration and perhaps supernatural favor from locations where divine power had once manifested dramatically. The relationship between Morrigan's sacred sites and political boundaries reflected the goddess's associations with sovereignty and territorial control. Sites marking the edges of tribal territories, the borders between kingdoms, and the boundaries of sacred precincts often bore Morrigan associations that emphasized her role in defining and defending spatial limits. The goddess who determined victory in battle also presided over the territorial arrangements that warfare established, making her presence at boundary locations particularly appropriate. Burial mounds and megalithic monuments throughout Ireland accumulated Morrigan associations that connected the goddess to ancestral veneration and the cult of the dead. These ancient structures, already charged with supernatural significance through their associations with prehistoric builders and buried ancestors, provided natural focal points for worship of a goddess so intimately connected with death and the afterlife. The Morrigan's ability to move between the worlds of living and dead found physical expression in monuments that themselves seemed to bridge ordinary and supernatural realms. The seasonal movements attributed to the Morrigan, her emergence from the cave at Samhain, her activities during the dark months, her return to subterranean dwelling as light returned, created temporal patterns that interacted with sacred geography to produce complex ritual calendars. Different sites might hold primary importance during different seasons, with pilgrimage patterns following the goddess's mythological movements across the landscape. This integration of sacred space and sacred time produced religious practices that engaged both geographical and calendrical dimensions of divine presence. Local traditions often preserved Morrigan associations for sites that might not appear in major mythological texts, creating layers of sacred geography that extended beyond elite literary traditions to encompass folk religious practices. A particular hill where crows gathered in unusual numbers, a spring whose waters were believed to have healing or prophetic properties, a stone formation that resembled the goddess in one of her forms. Such local sites supplemented the major centers of Morrigan worship with distributed sacred presence accessible to ordinary people in their immediate environments. The physical characteristics of Morrigan-associated sites often shared common features that reflected the goddess's mythological attributes. Darkness, whether in caves, dense forests, or locations associated with night and shadow, connected to her chthonic aspects and her associations with death and the hidden realms. Water, in rivers, springs, lakes, and coastal areas, reflected her connections to purification, prophecy, and the fluid boundaries between states of being. Elevated locations offering broad views suited her role as a battlefield observer and sovereign surveyor of territorial domains. The ritual practices performed at Morrigan sacred sites varied according to local traditions, seasonal timing, and the specific purposes that brought worshippers to these locations. Some sites primarily served divinatory functions, with practitioners seeking prophetic communications from the goddess through techniques appropriate to each location's characteristics. Others focused on offerings and thanksgiving, with worshippers leaving gifts to maintain the goddess's favor or fulfill vows made during times of crisis. Still others served as gathering places for collective rituals that reinforced community bonds through shared religious experience. The Christianization of Ireland transformed, but did not entirely eliminate the sacred geography associated with the Morrigan. Some sites were explicitly Christianized through the construction of churches, the dedication of locations to saints, or the reinterpretation of local traditions within Christian frameworks. Others retained their pre-Christian associations and folk memory, continuing to attract visitors who sought connections with older spiritual traditions even as official religion changed. The persistence of sacred geography, despite religious transformation, testifies to the deep roots that place-based spirituality had established in Irish consciousness. Archaeological investigation of Morrigan-associated sites has revealed material evidence of ritual activities that supplements and sometimes challenges literary accounts. Deposits of weapons, jewelry, animal bones, and other offerings at caves, rivers, and other sacred locations demonstrate the physical practices through which worshippers engaged with divine presence. The dating of such deposits helps establish chronologies for the development and persistence of site-specific religious practices, while the nature of deposited objects reveals something of the values and concerns that motivated ancient worshippers. Modern visitors to Morrigan sacred sites encounter landscapes transformed by centuries of agricultural development, urban expansion, and changing land use patterns. Yet the underlying geographical features that originally attracted sacred associations often remain recognizable. The Cave of the Cats still descends into darkness beneath Rathcrogan. Rivers still flow through landscapes marked by ancient mythology. Hills still offer commanding views across territories once contested in battles the goddess observed. These continuities enable contemporary seekers to connect with ancient sacred geography, despite the many changes that separate present from past. The revival of interest in Celtic spirituality has brought renewed attention to Morrigan's sacred sites, with modern practitioners developing new ritual practices for engaging with these locations. Contemporary pilgrimages to Rathcrogan and other significant sites combine historical research, personal spiritual seeking, and community building among those drawn to pre-Christian Irish traditions. These modern practices represent creative engagements with sacred geography rather than direct continuations of ancient worship, yet they demonstrate the enduring power of place-based spirituality to inspire religious experience. The concept of sacred geography itself, as exemplified by Morrigan-associated sites, offers valuable perspectives for contemporary discussions of environmental ethics, land preservation, and the spiritual dimensions of human relationships with place. The recognition that specific locations can hold sacred significance, that landscapes can be imbued with meaning that transcends their material characteristics, provides frameworks for valuing natural and cultural heritage that complement purely economic or ecological approaches. The Morrigan's sacred geography thus contributes to ongoing conversations about how humans should relate to the places they inhabit. The Morrigan's journey from ancient Celtic goddess to contemporary cultural icon spans millennia of transformation, adaptation, and reinterpretation, yet her essential nature, her associations with war, death, sovereignty, and transformation, continues to resonate with modern audiences seeking meaning in her mythology. This enduring relevance reflects both the timeless quality of the themes she embodies and the particular ways in which contemporary circumstances have created renewed interest in pre-Christian European spiritual traditions. The modern revival of interest in the Morrigan began in earnest during the late 20th century, emerging from broader movements of neo-paganism, feminist spirituality, and Celtic cultural revival that sought alternatives to dominant religious and cultural paradigms. For many contemporary seekers, the Morrigan offered a powerful female divine figure whose attributes, strength, independence, sexuality, and connection to death, contrasted sharply with the feminine ideals promoted by mainstream Western religions. Her refusal to conform to gentle, nurturing stereotypes of femininity made her particularly attractive to those seeking to expand concepts of sacred womanhood. The feminist dimensions of contemporary Morrigan devotion deserve particular attention, as the goddess has become an important figure for those exploring the intersection of spirituality and gender politics. Her mythology presents a female being of immense power who operates on her own terms, whose sexuality serves her own purposes rather than male desires, and whose authority derives from her own nature rather than relationships with male deities. These characteristics make her a compelling symbol for feminist spiritual seekers, though interpretations of her feminist significance vary considerably among different practitioners. Contemporary Morrigan devotion takes diverse forms, ranging from solitary personal practice to organized group worship, from historically informed reconstruction to eclectic spiritual synthesis. Some practitioners emphasize careful study of medieval sources and archaeological evidence, seeking to recover and revive ancient practices as accurately as possible. Others approach the goddess more intuitively, developing personal relationships through meditation, ritual, and direct spiritual experience without primary concern for historical accuracy. Both approaches, and many positions between them, find homes within the broad contemporary Morrigan community. The psychological dimensions of Morrigan devotion offer valuable perspectives, regardless of one's beliefs about the literal existence of deities. Engaging with a figure who embodies death, transformation, and the darker aspects of existence can facilitate psychological integration of shadow elements that mainstream culture often encourages people to suppress or deny. The Morrigan's mythology provides frameworks for confronting mortality, processing grief, embracing personal power, and navigating life transitions. Psychological work that has value independent of theological commitments. The warrior aspects of the Morrigan have found particular resonance among military personnel, martial artists, and others whose lives involve confrontation with violence and its consequences. For these practitioners, the goddess offers spiritual resources for understanding and integrating experiences that civilian religious traditions often struggle to address adequately. Her acceptance of violence as part of existence, her presence on battlefields, and her guidance of the dead provide frameworks for making meaning of martial experience within sacred contexts. The Morrigan's associations with sovereignty have taken on new significance in contemporary contexts of political struggle, social justice activism, and movements for self-determination. Her mythology presents sovereignty not as passive inheritance, but as active achievement, requiring courage, wisdom, and willingness to confront opposition. Contemporary practitioners have drawn upon these themes to support various political causes, finding in the goddess a patron for struggles against oppression and for the establishment of just social orders. The ecological dimensions of Morrigan devotion connect her to contemporary environmental concerns through her associations with the land, with natural cycles, and with the crow and other wild creatures. Some practitioners emphasize her role as a goddess of the earth, whose worship implies responsibility for environmental stewardship. The Morrigan's acceptance of death as part of natural cycles offers perspectives on ecological thinking that embrace rather than deny the role of mortality in healthy ecosystems. The artistic and creative communities have embraced the Morrigan as a muse and subject, producing an extensive body of contemporary work inspired by her mythology. Visual artists, musicians, writers, and performers have found in the goddess a source of creative inspiration that connects them to ancient traditions while enabling thoroughly contemporary expression. This artistic engagement keeps the Morrigan present in cultural consciousness, introducing her to audiences who might not otherwise encounter Celtic mythology. The academic study of the Morrigan continues to develop, with scholars from various disciplines contributing to understanding of her historical worship, literary representations, and contemporary revival. Religious studies scholars examine her place within broader patterns of goddess worship and contemporary paganism. Literary scholars analyze the medieval texts that preserve her mythology. Archaeologists investigate the material remains of her ancient cult. This scholarly attention provides foundations for informed engagement with the goddess, while also raising questions that challenge simplistic understandings. The global spread of Morrigan devotion beyond Ireland and the Celtic diaspora raises interesting questions about cultural appropriation, authentic tradition, and the universal versus particular dimensions of religious experience. Some argue that the goddess belongs specifically to Celtic peoples, and that non-Celtic practitioners engage in problematic appropriation. Others contend that deities transcend ethnic boundaries, and that sincere devotion matters more than ancestral heritage. These debates reflect larger conversations about identity, tradition, and spiritual authority in contemporary religious contexts. The digital age has transformed how Morrigan devotees connect, share information, and develop their practices. Online communities provide spaces for discussion, mutual support, and collective ritual that transcend geographical limitations. Social media platforms enable rapid sharing of artwork, poetry, and personal experiences related to the goddess. Digital resources make scholarly materials accessible to practitioners who might not otherwise have access to academic libraries. These technological developments have accelerated the growth and diversification of contemporary Morrigan devotion. The future of Morrigan devotion remains open, shaped by the choices of contemporary practitioners and the broader cultural currents within which their practices develop. The goddess who has survived millennia of transformation, from prehistoric origins through classical Celtic religion, medieval literary preservation, modern scholarly recovery, and contemporary spiritual revival, seems likely to continue evolving as new generations discover her mythology and develop their own relationships with her power. Her adaptability, her capacity to speak to enduring human concerns while taking forms appropriate to changing circumstances, suggests that the Morrigan will remain a vital presence in human spiritual life for generations to come. The Morrigan's ultimate significance may lie precisely in her complexity, her refusal to be reduced to simple categories or comfortable interpretations. She is goddess of war, yet also of sovereignty and fertility. She brings death, yet also transformation and renewal. She terrifies, yet also protects and guides. This complexity mirrors the complexity of existence itself, offering devotees a divine figure adequate to the full range of human experience, rather than sanitized versions that exclude life's darker dimensions. In embracing the Morrigan, contemporary practitioners embrace a vision of the sacred that includes rather than excludes the difficult, the dangerous, and the transformative aspects of being human. The Phantom Queen continues her flight across the battlefields of human existence, her crow's cry echoing through the centuries, her presence felt wherever mortals confront the great transitions of life and death. Those who hear her call and answer it join a tradition stretching back to the misty origins of Celtic civilization, participating in an ongoing relationship between humanity and the divine that transcends the boundaries of any single era or culture. The Morrigan endures because the realities she embodies endure: war and peace, death and life, endings and beginnings, the eternal dance of destruction and creation that defines existence itself.